Hi Nine, today we're going to finish off our annotations of A Wife in London. We're going to finish off stanzas 3 and 4. Hopefully you've just answered the quiz on stanzas 1 and 2. So just to recap, we revised the context, we've made sure we understand the writer's meanings. We did really well in that quiz, well done. And now again we're going to pick apart the writer's choices. And remember, we're just focusing today on stanzas 3 and 4 because we've already done 1 and 2. Okay, so we're going to be looking at word choices, structural choices and poetic techniques again. Sorry, just to remind you, obviously this is the same format as last lesson, last Thursday. So notes in your book, and then if you can print the poem, or if you want to do annotations on the computer, you can do, just that's fine. If not, just make sure that your notes on each quote are very clearly linked to a quote in your book. All right, so first thing, as I did last lesson, just to go over key poetic techniques that you might need, that you will need for these two stanzas today. Obviously, stanzas 3 and 4 come under the chapter, the irony. So I just wanted to make sure we're clear on what that means. There's loads of different types of irony. Well, not loads, but there's like quite a few. So we need to just pin down what irony means in this context, in this poem. So Hardy, basically, irony is always about some form of contrast. So when somebody speaks in a really posh voice, but they're saying things that you wouldn't associate with posh people, there's an irony there. There's a contrast between what's being said and how it's being said. So that's just one example. You might remember dramatic irony from plays where the audience knows more than the characters on stage. So there's a contrast of knowledge. And then here in this poem, which is the one that you need, there's a contrast between the expected and the reality. The irony is created by what the soldier, the husband writing home, hoped for, and actually the reality of what happened, which is obviously that he died and he never got to come home and do any of those things. Also, excuse me, the contrast between the woman, the wife, being told on one day your husband has died, and then the very next day actually hearing from him. It's almost like a voice from the grave. So there's a contrast there as well. That was unexpected. She would have gone to bed that night thinking, I'm never going to hear from my husband again, and then to have that contrasting experience the next day of actually getting a personal letter from him creates the irony as well. Okay, so I've said a lot more there than the definition. If you want to jot down any of that, just pause now. Okay, pathetic fallacy, official definition. So when a writer describes the weather in a way that symbolises the mood of the text or a specific character. So it could just be that it's a really miserable poem and the weather is really miserable in the poem, or it could be that one specific person is feeling a certain way and it's symbolised, and the weather is reflecting their mood. Obviously, this can be used in all literature texts, including novels. So hopefully you have come across that before. But yeah, that's it. That's it for these two stanzas. So let's get started with our annotations. Okay, so stanza 3, the one where the postman comes, is the easiest way to remember it. Okay, so we're going to start off by just focusing on that idea of the irony as the chapter title. So Hardy here is directing our feelings to this chapter, just like a novelist. He tells us what he wants us to focus on. So for me, I always think about this, because I think that what happens in stanzas 3 and 4 is so tragic. It's so sad. Well, more stanza 4, it's so tragic what's lost in stanza 4 in the future. That to me, the idea of the chapter 1 being called a tragedy, I feel like the whole poem is tragic. But it's really important to step back and think, well, why has Hardy directed us to focus on the irony? Why hasn't he called this chapter, the I don't know, the voice from the grave, or the husband's return? Well, firstly, the husband's return would be far too hopeful, wouldn't it? Because he's very cynical and he's very realistic about the war. So what we need to be focusing on here with the irony is the fact that this is really typical of Hardy's cynical style. Cynical being that he sort of sometimes can see the negatives in things, or at least he just wants to show the reality of the situation. We feel more bitter by focusing on the irony, like, oh, the ironic thing, the contrast between it is what makes war bad. The fact that we are, you know, you sold a lot, like we learned in Dulce, that you sold this lie to go and fight for war and it's going to be amazing and heroic, and actually this is the reality. So by focusing on the irony of this situation and the contrast between what was expected from the husband and the reality, he's really emphasizing the negative sides of war. And that, of course, is what makes this a modern war poem in its style, and it obviously reflects Hardy's purpose. Remember, we talked about his purpose was to expose war, not to sort of sugarcoat it. Okay, so line 11 then, because remember we already had 10 lines in stanzas 1 and 2. It really adds to the irony, the fact that it's the very next day. You know, this isn't a week later, it's literally the day after. So the contrast is sharper, which makes the irony more intense. It's also written in the present tense. It is tomorrow. It's not the fog hung quicker. It's not, it was the next day. It's very present, isn't it? We're experiencing this with the wife, so it makes the moment more intimate. We're with her as she experiences this turn of events, and that's a very clearly you know, conscious choice by Hardy to bring us in and take us through this moment with the wife, again making us more emotionally involved and therefore more likely to be against the war. He also says the fog hangs quicker. So again, he's using these symbolic layers. Symbolic layers is a nice phrase you might want to use in your essays because he uses it a lot, doesn't he? So do you remember in stanza 1 we had the vapor and it could represent about 3 different things. So this is classic Hardy again. So the fog hangs thicker. There's 3 interpretations that we can get out of this. Firstly, he's just describing the literal weather outside the window, which is where our pathetic fallacy comes in, because of course the fog hangs thicker symbolises the wife's mood, she's grieving. Yeah. We've also got the second option, that the fog hanging thicker could be the uncertainty that's hanging over the city because of the war, that everything's clouded, nobody can see their futures clearly because they don't know what's going to happen. And then I don't like that one as much, but it is there. And then number 3, which is my favourite one, is that it's the wife's own vapour is now thicker. So if you remember in stanza 1, she was sitting in a tawny vapour. In the exact same position of this chapter, the end of the first line, we've got not she sits in a tawny vapour, but the fog hangs thicker. So you've got this direct contrast created by the comparative thicker. So even though he's not used the vapor hangs thicker, we feel like he's describing that same thing because it's in the same position. So we've got this idea of the wife's depressive state is now thicker, it's now worse. Okay, so if we think about connotations of those words, because you should be doing this with us, you know, when you're analysing, you should be exploring what's suggested by the word, what are the connotations, what do we associate with the word. Thicker suggests that it's heavier, doesn't it? Something's thicker, it's usually heavier. And it's also harder to overcome. I mean, you'll probably know yourself, if anytime you've been going to school, the fog's thicker, it's obviously harder to see, isn't it? It's harder to get through, it slows you down. And I think that that can be a real symbol of grief. And then connotation of hangs, it suggests that it's here to stay. You know, the fog is not flowing through the house, it's not flowing through the city, it's just literally hanging there, just like the wife was sitting there in stanza 1. So again, you've got this idea of passivity, that nothing's changing, that everything's kind of stopped with the husband's death. And again, that symbolises grief, doesn't it? Kind of debilitates you, it stops you from moving, it stops you from growing, you know, keeps you in one place. So I mean, look at all that you can get out of just the fog hangs thicker, and look at how you can cross-reference, you can link it back to the first stanza and that first line about tawny vapour, the wife sitting, the fog is hanging, the vapour, and now it's thicker. So it's really, really beautifully crafted, and it's really easy. Well, it's a really like rich line for you to analyse in your essays, because look at all that you can get out of it. Okay, so that was definitely worth the time on, and make sure you've got that level of detail down, and pause now if you want to spend a bit longer on that. Okay, carrying on with stanza 3 then. So we've got the postman nears and goes. Just have a think about the difference between comes and goes. and nears and goes. There's a distance created, isn't there? Yeah. So to me, this line again really highlights the lack of contact that the wife is having in this city. It feels like the city's got its own personality, its own character, like a novelist would create that, wouldn't they? So it feels like the wife isn't interacting with anybody. The postman is nearing her, but he's not coming to her, and he's just going again. It's again a very impersonal interaction, just like he had with the messenger. She had with the messenger, sorry, in stanza 2. Okay. A letter is brought whose lines disclose. I hope you can notice there that it's a very clinical line, isn't it? It's very detached of emotion. And I think what it like literally to disclose is just to say something. There's no sense there of what, like the emotional background of actually what's in this letter. He's just focusing on the function of a letter, which is to disclose something, to tell someone something. Even a letter is very passive. He's just telling us a story. He's telling us what happened. It's very blunt. There is a letter brought, and in it says this. Yeah. And he's just stating the facts. So there's a change in tone here that it's built from this idea of us focusing on irony. He wants us to focus on the bitterness of it, and the bluntness of what war is. And he's just saying, look what war does. Look what it does. It brings these letters, and in these letters, this is what it says. And we should all feel bad about this. We should all be focusing on what's lost here. It's not quite as it's not as obviously as shocking or angry as Dulce et Cor Est is, but it's certainly getting there in terms of its blunt tone, far more than any other poem that we've studied in the war poems so far. Okay. All right. We've then got the firelight flicker in line 14. Now, hopefully you can remember from last week that a motif is like a symbol or an object or a thing that is frequently referred to across the text. And we said that coldness was constantly referred to in stanzas 1 and 2. And the tone of coldness still continues. Fog hanging thicker is a very cold image, isn't it? But now, finally, we have this first reference to warmth in the entire poem. So he contrasts his motif here by symbolizing the warmth that this letter brings her. Yeah, we finally got this sense that the woman isn't completely sat. In stanzas 1 and 2, you would probably be able to imagine a woman sat in a chair, like freezing, lonely, surrounded by like vapors and horrible darkness and fading lights and not going anywhere. Finally, I now see instead in my head a woman. She's sat in like a rocking chair, and she's got like a blanket over her lap, and she's got a letter in her lap. But at least she's by a fire now. Weirdly, I always picture my auntie's house with its fire. I don't know why. Maybe I really like her fire. But anyway, that's what I picture. And the point is that as Hardy's choice here is to force us to picture that, to force us to picture a little bit of a warmer image, symbolising the warmth that this letter brings her, which is lovely, isn't it? And it is really nice when you hear from somebody that you love or that you've not heard from a while, and you think, oh, it's nice that they thought of me. Of course, probably now it would be a message or, I don't know, Snapchat. Okay. And then finally, we have already spoken quite a lot about this line, his hand whom the worm now knows. So of course we know that his hand is a husband's hand. He doesn't need to say her husband. We can work that out. We're smart readers. But whom the worm now knows, again, this blunt tone, this really, really like exposing fact of war, he doesn't shy away from. Compare this line to the soldier, where he's like, I'll be eternally buried in I'll turn the soil English because I'm so patriotic when I die. Well, no, if you look at Hardy's poem, then what will actually happen to that soldier is that he will get eaten by worms in the ground. Yeah, it's a rotting body image. Now, I know that's not particularly nice, but the point, of course, is that sums up Hardy's intentions and his purpose and what he wants his readers to take away from this. I am not going to sugarcoat war, he says. I am not shying away from the reality of this situation. This is what will be happening to this body right now. It's scientifically true, isn't it? It's what would happen to the body. There's no romanticizing of war here. Yeah, And this line, I think more than any line in the entire poem, is what makes it a modern war poem in its style. This line is far more similar to something like Dulce, where we have that kind of the throat gargling and the corrupted lungs and all that kind of harsh exposing language. This is Hardy's version of that. So really, really modern in its style, even though it was obviously a long time before the modern era. Sorry, I'm distracted because my husband's just bought me some chocolate, which is nice. Very much like the letter Firelight Flicker. Okay, let's move on then. Stanza 4, the one with the lost future, which is to me the saddest stanza in the whole poem and the one that gets me every time. Right, so a lot of these phrases we have spoke about in the understanding PowerPoint, so hopefully I'm not going to say anything too unexpected here. I don't think I've talked to you about the word firm yet though. So firm obviously can just be a description of his handwriting as a literal level, that, you know, he's written it in a very firm hand, very good firm hand, where everything is neat and everything is ordered and everything is carefully crafted and beautiful. But obviously, as we know, this is Hardy, so he's symbolising something else, isn't he? So we can say here that to me that he's writing in this firm way suggests that he is very convinced of what he's saying. Yeah, that he's very convinced about his future. You know, he's writing all of this in a firm hand. I am going to come home. I am going to go on home plan jaunts with you. We are going to have some summer weather. We are going to have a new love. And this, of course, makes it even more ironic. Yeah, because there's a contrast. This is what he expected to do very firmly, and in reality, he's now the hand who the worm now knows. Okay, we have spoken about highest feather before, so just to remind you that again, he's describing literally a perfect pen, a beautiful pen, a very elegant pen, and it really symbolises how much love and care he's put into the letter. Okay, and line 17, we're nearly there. He highlights how much he wrote. It's a page full of his hoped return. This is not just one line. I'm really hopeful to get back to you soon. See you later. Ciao. He's actually spent an entire page. We don't know how big the page is, but let's imagine it's a lot of writing, going into a lot of detail about all these hopes and dreams that he has for him and his wife. And of course, again, it makes it more ironic and to me just more tragic. This man has sat there and wrote all these plans down for his future, and that future's been stripped away from him by the war and stripped away from his wife as well. And remember that this is something that other poems don't focus on. So Mammoth's Wood has the same feelings, doesn't it? That these wasted young had their lives taken away from them by war. But actually, we don't want to stop and think in Mammoth's Wood about their mothers or their wives or their sons or their daughters and the people they have at home. Hardy does make us think of those things. It's not just this soldier who's lost his life and his future. It's the wife as well. It's the people at home as well. Okay. Lovely line, home plan jaunts by break and burn. So obviously we know a jaunt is like an adventure, a day out. So we've got that joyous image of a jaunt. Like, let's go on a jaunt. Might not have had many jaunts recently, but jaunts are fun. And then we've got that, you know, this break and burn, this sense of adventure. They're going on a fun time and they're going to have lots of crazy things happen to them. There's a sense of innocence and youthfulness there, isn't there? Which again reminds me a bit of Mammoth's Wood. You know, and he's saying here, look at what you lose when you go to war. Look at this enthusiasm for life and hope and adventure and sense of fun. And we just took all that away from him and from her as well. This is what she could have experienced. How long, if ever, do you think it's going to take her till she can get to a point where she's going to go on an adventure, a home plan jaunt with anybody else? She's going to be grieving for a long time, isn't she? So it's really, really, really a sense of tragic irony here that this is what war has taken from this couple. And remember, go back to the title. This is A Wife in London. This is one of many. Okay, and the last line, which is probably my favourite line in the poem. I hope I've not said that about another line. Like, this is my favourite line, and this is my favourite line. I definitely think that this is the most tragic line in the poem. So I said, whom the worm now knows, I feel is the most kind of modern war poem, like line, like exposing the horror of war. I think that this is just really tragic, that this is what's lost. So he's, to me, new love they would learn, that's gone now. And I think it really embodies how much war costs people. It costs them possibility. It costs them the opportunity to explore and grow and just live, because that's what life is, isn't it? Just growing and exploring and becoming different people and learning things and changing and growing with the people around you, and sometimes shedding the people around you and making new friends and finding new people. But that's what was taken away, the possibility, the chance, the opportunity of life, and growing with his wife and learning new things about each other and new love for each other. So their entire future together has just gone, just like that, because of war. So he's really, really emphasizing the tragedy of war here. And of course, the bigger irony that's at play here, it's not that a wife received a letter the day after her husband died from her husband. It's the fact that we are told that wars are worth fighting and that they're a force of good and they lead to gains, when actually they cost us a lot. They take things away from us. We lose more than we gain. Yeah. Now, you can debate that for some wars, of course, but here for the Boer War in 1899, in late in the year when the war hadn't long started, this is how hard he was feeling, and this is what he wanted us to think. Look at what wars cost. This is not positive. And let's, obviously, if you imagine if you were living in London at the time, how that might have reflected your feelings. A final thought about this is, when you did The Soldier, you might have thought about the idea that, obviously it's a really positive poem, it's a really patriotic poem, it was 1914, the war had just started. Maybe people needed to hear Brooks' message at that point. Maybe people needed to hear a positive poem, something that would inspire them and make them feel positive about the war, because, people were going whether they liked it or not. Well, I suppose that conscription hadn't started at that point, but obviously if war's inevitable, which it obviously was at that point because it had already been declared, then, maybe it helps to have a poet who's writing positively about a war. Have a think about what impact Hardy's poem would have had on the wives of London if they'd have read it. Have a look, think about what the pros and cons of this style of poem are at a time of war. Do people want to be exposed to the realities of the situation and get angry and feel like they're not alone and they're being listened to? Or instead, do they want to be a little bit sheltered and focus on the heroic deeds that their husbands are doing? So that's just something worth thinking about, and I think it reflects very nicely our current situation, really. I think some people have wanted to hear about coronavirus, positive news, and kind of focusing on what's going right, whereas others have wanted to hear the reality of the situation and know what's going on. So quite an interesting parallel, although I think that there's been too many links between war and coronavirus, so I'll leave that there. All right, so hopefully the last two stanzas there are really clear to you. Can you please message me if there's any lines you're not sure about, because it's really important that you don't go forward not being clear on anything Hardy means. There will be a quiz tomorrow on these two stanzas. And then what there's no lesson on Thursday this week because it's inset day, so next week will be a bit of a consolidation week. I'm going to go through all your quizzes, look at what questions you might be getting wrong, and fill in any gaps that way. And then we will start thinking about doing a little bit of writing on this poem before we move on to the final poem, which is The Manhunt, which is not, as you might think, about police hunting down a man. Sorry if that disappoints you. Okay. See you. So I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thanks, Year 9. Bye.